Maria Alvarez had never imagined herself in a place like this. Born and raised in a small town in Texas, she had spent most of her life in kitchens, learning the rhythm of pots clanging, knives chopping, and the scent of spices filling the air. Cooking wasn't just a job for her. It was a language, a way of expressing care. Her abuela had taught her that food could heal more than the body. It could mend hearts, comfort the broken, and create bonds stronger than blood. She had always believed this, and it was this belief that led her to a decision she never expected to make. When Maria first arrived at the naval base in Virginia, she felt out of place. The air smelled of diesel and salt, of sweat and discipline. Soldiers in camouflage moved with precision, their faces sharp and eyes even sharper. She had walked in carrying her knives and a stack of recipe books, her apron neatly folded over her arm, feeling the weight of every stare. These weren't people you joked with lightly. They were SEALs, some of the country's most elite. And yet, within the first few days, she found herself slipping into their routines, laughing at their dry humor, and learning their schedules as if she were part of the team. Her first meal was a disaster. She had tried to cook a traditional enchilada casserole, adjusting spices to match the soldiers' rugged tastes. But the oven had been too small, the heat uneven, and she miscalculated the timing. The first bites drew grimaces, and she braced herself for ridicule. Instead, a burly SEAL with a neatly trimmed beard leaned back, smiled, and said, "Well, Mama Maria, it's not perfect, but it's got heart. We'll take it." The nickname stuck. Soon, every time she appeared with trays of steaming food, they called her Mama Maria, half in jest, half in reverence. She began to learn their stories, one meal at a time. At first, they were guarded, only offering fragments of their lives. The young ones, barely out of their 20s, told her about training drills that left them bleeding and exhausted, while seasoned veterans hinted at deployments that scarred more than their bodies. Maria listened quietly, asking questions when appropriate, always careful not to intrude. But there was something about her presence, her warmth, her unwavering focus on them that made the soldiers open up. Slowly, the base kitchen became a sanctuary. When Maria chopped vegetables or stirred sauces, the men would sit nearby, sipping coffee, laughing, or sharing quiet confessions. It was in these moments that Maria realized the depth of her connection to them. She had no military background, no understanding of combat strategies, and no experience in war zones. Yet she felt responsible for these men. Every laugh, every smile she could elicit felt like a small victory against the world outside the base. She remembered one night when a young CAL named Torres confided that he had lost 2 friends in Afghanistan. Maria had quietly placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a slice of chocolate cake, and reminded him that memories weren't chains, they were honor. Tears had filled his eyes, and he had whispered, "I don't know how you do this, Maria. You make us feel human again." Her decision to volunteer for deployment had been sudden. The Navy announced that her unit, the support staff, would accompany a SEAL team on a mission overseas. Most civilians were pulled back, deemed unnecessary in a combat zone, but Maria insisted. She argued that her role went beyond cooking, that she was a source of morale, a piece of the team's stability. The SEALs tried to discourage her. "It's dangerous, Maria," one said, serious for the first time. "This isn't a kitchen anymore. You could get hurt." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not afraid," she said softly. "If you're going, I'm going. I don't just feed you. I protect you in my way." Reluctantly, they accepted. The training for deployment was grueling, even for a civilian. Maria learned to move stealthily, to carry supplies efficiently, and to read maps. She shadowed the SEALs during drills, absorbing the rhythm of their movements. At night, she would lie awake in her cot, imagining scenarios she hoped never to encounter, but knew she might. She practiced breathing calmly, even in fear, and memorized the basic handling of emergency weapons, not knowing if she'd ever need them. Her mind shifted. She was no longer just a cook, she was a protector, a silent participant in a world she had only glimpsed from afar. The day they departed, Maria felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. She watched the base fade behind her as the convoy rolled toward the port. The sun beat down mercilessly, dust swirling around the vehicles. Her hands itched to do anything, but she was strapped into her seat, powerless to act. Yet she observed. Every detail mattered: the cadence of the engines, the way soldiers scanned the horizon, the faintest sign of movement in the desert beyond. She was learning, absorbing everything, preparing herself in ways even she did not fully understand. Even in the convoy, her role as cook persisted. She handed out meals, ensured water supplies were adequate, and cracked jokes when tension threatened to spiral. She had discovered a strange truth. Morale was a weapon just as lethal as any rifle. A team that laughed, even for a few minutes, was stronger than one that succumbed to fear. Soldiers began to rely on her presence as much as their weapons. "Mama Maria's here," they would mutter under their breath, a grounding ritual before heading into operations. But amid the laughter and preparation, Maria couldn't ignore the nagging tension in the air. The desert was vast, unforgiving, and unpredictable. Intelligence reports hinted at potential ambushes. She noticed the subtle changes in her comrades: eyes narrowing, posture stiffening, hands lingering near holsters. Every instinct screamed caution. Maria had been trained for kitchens, for comfort, not combat. And yet, an unfamiliar resolve stirred within her, a whisper that she might be called to do more than cook. She brushed the thought away with a shaky laugh, returning to chopping onions, but the seed of awareness had been planted. As night fell, the convoy camped on a ridge overlooking the desert expanse. Maria sat by a small fire, stirring a pot of stew while listening to the soldiers' quiet conversations. Stars stretched endlessly above her, indifferent to the human tension below. She watched their faces, saw fatigue etched into young skin, the faint tremor of nerves, and felt a protective surge. These men were her family now. They depended on her, not for survival, not yet, but for comfort, for steadiness, for the human touch that reminded them there was more at stake than orders and missions. Hours later, Maria lay in her cot, the aroma of her stew lingering in the air. She thought about home, her abuela's kitchen, the life she had paused to be here. But she didn't regret it. Each day she spent among these warriors strengthened her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She understood the stakes, the fragility of life, and the quiet courage required to face the unknown. And deep down she sensed that the desert, the mission, and the seals she protected would demand more than she had ever imagined, and she would rise to meet it. By the time dawn broke, Maria Alvarez was no longer just a cook. She was a witness, a guardian, and an unlikely soldier in a war that hadn't yet revealed its face. And though she didn't know it, her journey was about to shift from stirring pots to gripping rifles, from comforting to confronting, from safe to survival. The line between civilian and warrior blurred, and Maria felt a quiet readiness settle in her chest, as though the desert itself whispered, "You are ready." The convoy rolled deeper into the desert, the horizon stretching like an endless sea of sand and stone. Maria Alvarez sat upright in the back of the Humvee, her hands clenched in her lap, nerves coiled like springs. The heat pressed down relentlessly, baking the metal of the vehicles, drying her throat, and making every movement an effort. Dust swirled around them, a constant reminder that the environment was as dangerous as any human enemy. Every so often, Maria glanced at the SEALs, their faces set in tight masks of focus. Even in the briefest moments, she could see the war in their eyes, the weight of deployments past and dangers yet to come. The SEALs were quiet for the most part, communicating through hand signals and short nods. Maria's heart pounded in response to the silence, interpreting it as tension rather than routine. She had learned quickly that in moments like this, every micro-expression mattered. One misread glance could mean the difference between staying calm and giving away panic. She focused on her breathing, reminding herself of everything she had learned since volunteering. Stay alert, stay low, observe, and keep morale alive even in the darkest moments. It was mid-afternoon when the first sign of trouble appeared. From her vantage point, Maria noticed a glint of sunlight off what seemed like a ridge of rocks far ahead. It could have been nothing but instincts, whether trained or born of sheer survival, whispered that danger was near. She scanned the horizon, noticing a second smaller flash further to the left. Her pulse quickened. The SEALs in the front vehicles had already slowed their pace, eyes scanning and rifles ready. Maria felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. She had survived heat, exhaustion, and long nights on patrols, but she had never faced an enemy in this form. The convoy's lead vehicle turned sharply, attempting to flank the rocky outcropping when the world erupted into chaos. Gunfire ripped through the air, the sharp crack of rifles followed by explosions that threw sand into the wind. Tires screeched. Vehicles lurched and collided. The air became thick with smoke and panic. Maria flung herself to the floor, instinctively covering her head as the Humvee skidded across the rough terrain. Shouts and screams tore through the cacophony. The reality hit her. They had been ambushed. Masked militants surged from behind boulders and sand dunes, their movements fast and lethal. Maria watched, frozen momentarily, as soldiers fought back with precision. Bullets shredded the air around her, ricocheting off metal and stone. Her hands trembled violently as she reached for the floor strap of the Humvee. One soldier nearby shouted an order she didn't understand in the midst of chaos. Maria didn't need to understand it. She needed to survive. She needed to think. Every second could determine life or death. One vehicle flipped, throwing its passengers to the ground. Maria rolled instinctively, her apron snagging on a metal panel, but she forced herself upright. Dust filled her lungs. Grit scraped her throat. She looked for the SEALs, scanning for any sign of life. They were everywhere and nowhere shouts, hand signals, bodies moving with lethal coordination. She froze as she realized she could see their bindings. In a blur, masked militants had overpowered her team, zip-tying their wrists and shoving them into waiting trucks. Maria's stomach lurched. This wasn't a drill. This was real, and she was powerless to stop it. Or so she thought. A surge of adrenaline snapped her out of frozen terror. She remembered her training, the silent preparation she had endured, and the promises she had made to herself and to the soldiers. Do not let them win. Maria's gaze fell on a wounded SEAL, his leg mangled and bleeding profusely. "Take it," he gasped, shoving a rifle into her hands. Maria's stomach twisted. She had never fired a weapon in anger, never aimed at another human being with lethal intent. Yet, as she looked into his fading eyes, she realized the choice was hers. Act or watch them die. Her hands shook violently as she lifted the rifle, adjusting her grip. The weight felt impossible, foreign, yet somehow grounding. She recalled the countless hours of observing the SEALs in training, their stances, their breathing, their calm in chaos. She mimicked what she had seen, holding her breath, squinting down the barrel. The sound of approaching footsteps brought her to a decision. A militant rounded the overturned vehicle, unaware of her presence. She fired. The world seemed to pause as the man collapsed silently. Maria exhaled, adrenaline burning through her veins. The first step had been taken. Using the fallen militant as cover, Maria crawled to her team, scanning the surroundings constantly. Each step was calculated, each breath measured. Her heart pounded, and her palms burned against the metal of the Humvee. She reached the wounded SEAL, who struggled to speak. "Can you help?" he whispered, voice barely audible over the chaos. Maria nodded, biting back fear. She ripped strips of cloth from her apron to bandage his wounds, improvising as she had done in training simulations. But this was no drill. Her hands were stained with blood, sweat, and sand, but she refused to falter. From her vantage point, Maria observed the compound ahead. Bound SEALs were herding into what seemed like a fortified area. She realized then that this wasn't just an ambush. It was a calculated trap. Fear and rage collided within her. How many had survived? How many would be lost? Her mind raced, assessing options. Retreat was impossible. Surrender was unthinkable. She adjusted the rifle, her vision sharpening with a focus she hadn't known she possessed. Maria Alvarez, civilian cook, had become a participant in a war she had never chosen, but one she would fight to the end. The sun beat down relentlessly as Maria crept along the rocky terrain, using every shadow for cover. Her movements were deliberate, a blend of learned observation and instinct. Every crunch of gravel, every whisper of wind, every small detail mattered. She noted guard patterns, timing, positions, and numbers. Her hands were raw, her muscles aching, but she pushed forward. Every second counted, every step brought her closer to the team she could not abandon. Failure was unthinkable. The desert around her became both ally and enemy, offering cover while hiding dangers that could end everything in a heartbeat. She came upon a lone sentry, humming softly, unaware of her presence. Maria's pulse throbbed in her ears, but she steadied her hands. One breath, one squeeze. The weight of the rifle felt like destiny pressing down on her. She fired. The man dropped silently, and Maria felt a strange mixture of horror and relief. She dragged him into shadow, catching her breath, feeling the full gravity of what she had done. Survival demanded action. Protection demanded courage. And she had chosen both. The SEAL's eyes widened as they recognized her from the ridge above. Could this really be the same woman who baked them brownies? Who laughed and joked over steaming plates of food? They hesitated, disbelief mingling with hope. Maria hissed, "Follow me," motioning toward a partially obscured back exit. The path was narrow, dangerous, and uncertain, but it was the only chance. With trembling hands but unwavering resolve, Maria led them, a civilian cook turned guardian, into a hostile world that demanded more than they had ever imagined. The desert, once merely a backdrop to their mission, became an arena of life and death. Every step forward was both triumph and risk. Bullets snapped past, sand erupted around them, and the air grew heavy with smoke and dust. Yet Maria pressed on, driven by determination, love, and a fierce refusal to surrender. By the time they reached the shadowed edges of the compound, she had transformed completely. No longer just a cook, she was now a protector, a strategist, and the heart of a team fighting against impossible odds. The wind whipped sand into Maria's eyes, stinging, blinding, but she refused to blink. Each grain felt like fire, but she forced herself to focus. The SEALs, her team, were bound and kneeling, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, guarded by masked militants who seemed oblivious to her presence. Every second she spent calculating, observing, and moving toward them was a second closer to either salvation or death. Maria's heart thundered in her chest, her mind split between fear and fierce determination. She had never imagined holding a rifle in her life, yet here she was, staring down the enemy in their own compound. Her hands trembled as she gripped the weapon, recalling the countless hours of watching the SEALs train. She remembered the cadence of their breaths, the slow raising and lowering of rifles, the precision of their stances. Mimicking them as best she could, She crouched low behind a jagged boulder, surveying the compound. There were 4 guards on the immediate perimeter, and at least 6 more near the central courtyard where the seals were being held. Maria realized she had to act methodically. One wrong move would mean their deaths. She took a deep breath, letting instinct and observation guide her. The first sentry approached, humming softly, weapon slung lazily across his chest. Maria's finger hovered over the trigger, shaking violently, but her resolve solidified. One breath, one squeeze. The rifle discharged, echoing in the compound like thunder. The man crumpled silently, hitting the sand without alerting the others. Maria's stomach twisted at the sight, but she forced herself to move, dragging the body into shadow. Every step was deliberate, each movement measured. Fear was present, but it no longer ruled her. Crawling along the jagged ridge, she spotted a second guard pacing near the seals. He was unarmed at the moment, speaking into a radio. Maria's heart skipped a beat. Any noise could compromise the entire operation. She waited, counting the seconds, watching the subtle shifts in his posture, waiting for the perfect opening. As seals below exchanged glances, eyes widening in disbelief. Could it really be Maria Alvarez, apron and all, leading the charge to save them? She gave a barely perceptible nod, and they understood. This civilian had become their only hope. As Maria drew closer, she remembered a small detail from her observation of the seals. Use the environment to your advantage. She found a narrow slit in the compound's wall, just wide enough to partially conceal her movement. She slid through, rifle raised, keeping her eyes on the guards and her body low. Her palms were raw, her arms burning, but adrenaline and necessity overrode every ache. She had no choice now. She was no longer simply a witness. The team depended on her, and failure was not an option. The seals had shifted slightly, loosening their bindings where possible, awaiting her signal. Maria reached the edge of the courtyard, a small rise granting her partial cover. The first guard came into view, walking toward the central holding area. She fired. The shot rang out with precision she didn't know she possessed, and he fell without alarm. Maria's breath came in ragged bursts, but she didn't stop. Another guard moved to investigate. She fired again, careful to remain hidden. One by one, she eliminated the immediate threats, her movements becoming more fluid, more confident with each successful strike. The seal's eyes reflected both astonishment and relief. For a moment, Maria allowed herself a brief glance at them. Torres, the wounded young seal she had first tended in the convoy, gave her a faint nod of encouragement. She swallowed the lump in her throat and returned her attention to the task at hand. She edged toward the bindings, snatching the cutting tool she had carried discreetly from a fallen guard. The metallic scrape against the zip ties sounded like an eternity. Each soldier she freed required careful guidance, whispered instructions, and constant vigilance. One wrong sound, and the militants would descend upon them. "Stay low," she whispered, voice barely audible over the chaos. The seals obeyed, their trained instincts guiding them as they followed her through shadows and cover. Maria felt a surge of exhilaration, fear, and determination fused into a single, unrelenting purpose. The desert wind carried the distant sound of approaching reinforcements, but they weren't there yet. Every second mattered, every movement was a gamble. Maria's mind was hyper-aware of her surroundings. Every sand dune, every rocky outcrop, every window could conceal another threat. She moved like a phantom, silent and precise, fully inhabiting the role she had never imagined herself playing. By now, the team had nearly reached the back exit of the compound. The final guard was posted near the only clear pathway to freedom. Maria crouched low behind a pile of debris, assessing him. He was heavily armed, scanning the terrain carefully, but Maria noticed his attention wavered slightly. He hadn't expected anyone this far in. She adjusted her grip on the rifle and fired, hitting him with deadly accuracy. He crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Maria's arms ached, her palms blistered, but the team's survival now rested in their ability to move swiftly. She waved them forward. The SEALs, though still battered, moved with the fluidity of elite warriors. Maria kept pace, rifle ready, heart hammering. Dust and smoke clouded the air, punctuated by the distant cracks of gunfire. Her fear was still present, but it had evolved into something sharper, more focused, a driving determination to protect those who had become her family. She glanced briefly at Torres, whose leg was bleeding badly. "Almost there," she whispered. "Keep moving." The SEALs trusted her implicitly, a trust forged in moments of shared danger. She would not let them down. As they approached the edge of the compound, Maria noticed a shadow moving at the perimeter, a final potential threat. The SEALs froze, instincts flaring, but Maria stepped forward, raising her rifle. Her breath was steady now, hands surprisingly calm despite exhaustion. She fired a single shot, and the shadow slumped to the sand. A wave of relief washed over her, followed immediately by exhaustion. She had done it. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, from cook to guardian, from observer to warrior. The SEALs were free, but freedom didn't mean safety. Maria guided the team through the rocky terrain toward the rendezvous point, all senses alert. Every sound, every movement could signal reinforcements, ambushes, or worse. The desert, once a passive backdrop, had transformed into a battleground, each dune a potential hazard, each boulder a hiding place. Yet Maria pressed forward, every step reinforcing her new reality. She had become someone entirely new, someone capable of acts she had never imagined herself performing. Her identity as Mama Maria, the cook, had shifted into Maria Alvarez, the protector. By the time they reached the designated extraction point, sweat and sand coated their bodies. The SEALs' breaths came in ragged bursts, but gratitude and astonishment shone in their eyes. Maria collapsed momentarily behind a dune, rifle still clutched in trembling hands. She had never felt such exhaustion, nor such exhilaration. Fear, adrenaline, and determination had carried her this far. She realized, in a quiet, terrifying moment of clarity, that she would never be the same. The desert had claimed part of her old self, forging something stronger, sharper, and irrevocably brave. When the helicopters finally arrived, cutting through the desert sky like metallic birds of salvation, Maria and the SEALs climbed aboard, bodies bruised, minds racing. As the blades whipped up sand around them, Maria felt a strange combination of relief and defiance. She had survived. She had saved them. And she had discovered, in the midst of chaos, that courage didn't come from rank, training, or preparation. It came from refusing to let fear decide your actions. Maria Alvarez, the civilian cook, had transformed into something extraordinary. And the war was far from over. The desert air tore at Maria Alvarez's face, sand whipping into her eyes and stinging like needles. Her arms ached from holding the rifle, and her palms were raw, blistered from gripping both weapon and terrain. Behind her, the SEALs moved cautiously, their hands free but tense, eyes scanning for threats. Each step was calculated. Each sound a distant scrape, a whisper of movement, a clatter of metal made her pulse quicken. Maria's body was exhausted, but adrenaline and fear propelled her forward. She had become the guide, the shield, and the voice of authority in a world that offered none. The first objective was to clear the perimeter without drawing attention. The compound's outer walls loomed, jagged shadows hiding unseen enemies. Maria crouched behind a cluster of boulders, scanning the area. Her stomach knotted as a sentry appeared, armed and vigilant. Her fingers tightened on the rifle, knuckles white. She recalled the positions, the timing of their patrols, and the lessons learned in the previous hour: patience, precision, and silence. She fired a single silent shot. The man collapsed, his body hidden behind a mound of sand. No alarm sounded. Relief surged, but Maria knew the danger was far from over. Guiding the SEALs along a narrow, rocky ridge, she kept them low, whispering instructions. "Follow me, slow and steady." "Stay quiet," she urged. Torres limped beside her, his breathing labored, sweat and blood streaking his face. Another SEAL covered their rear, scanning for shadows. Maria's eyes darted constantly, calculating angles, distances, and cover. Each movement was a balance between speed and stealth. A sudden gust of wind sent a cloud of sand into their path, momentarily blinding them. Maria froze, heart hammering. One mistake could alert the remaining militants. She waited, counting heartbeats, until the dust settled before continuing. They reached a small ravine that offered temporary cover. Maria motioned for the SEALs to halt. She crouched, scanning the open desert, noting enemy positions and potential reinforcements. She realized the militants were regrouping, calling for backup. The team's survival depended on speed and coordination, but she also recognized that fear could be paralyzing. Her own pulse raced, yet a strange calm had settled over her mind. She had passed the threshold of fear now. Determination guided her actions. One step, one shot, one decision at a time. That was all survival demanded. As they moved forward, Maria noticed a pair of militants heading toward the ridge they were crossing. She signaled to the SEALs to take cover and raised her rifle. She fired once, hitting one of them before they could react. The second froze, then bolted back toward the compound. Maria's heart raced, but there was no time to dwell. She motioned the SEALs to follow her lead. The path was narrow and littered with jagged stones, forcing them to move single file. Every crunch of gravel underfoot threatened to betray them. Maria's throat was dry, her arms screaming with fatigue, but she pressed on, refusing to falter. The SEALs exchanged glances, disbelief and respect mirrored in their eyes. This was the same woman who had once baked them cookies and laughed at their jokes, now leading them through a battlefield with a precision that rivaled trained operatives. Maria felt a surge of emotion, pride, fear, determination, and grief all coalescing into a single force that drove her forward. She had crossed a line she could never return from, but there was no turning back. The team's lives depended on her decisions, and she would not fail. Reaching a rocky overhang, they paused to catch their breath. Maria scanned the horizon. The extraction point was visible in the distance, a faint glimmer of hope amid the vast desert. Yet the militants were closing in. She calculated the timing carefully. "We move on my count," she whispered, voice low but firm. "Two at a time. Stay low. Keep moving." The SEALs nodded, trusting her implicitly. With a deep breath, Maria led the first pair forward, sprinting the short distance to the next cover point. Bullets kicked up sand around them, forcing her to dive behind a boulder. Her muscles screamed, but she couldn't stop. Torres stumbled, his leg throbbing with pain. Maria grabbed his arm, pulling him to cover. "Almost there," she said, though her voice wavered with fatigue. "Keep going. Don't stop." She scanned for threats, firing at shadows when necessary, each shot deliberate and controlled. Another SEAL covered their rear, providing suppressive fire as they moved forward. Maria's training, observation, and instincts had merged into a rhythm, each movement precise, each decision critical. Fear still existed, but it no longer dictated her actions. She was in control, and that control was their lifeline. As they neared the extraction zone, headlights flashed in the distance. Maria's pulse surged with hope. Reinforcements had arrived. But the militants were not finished. They surged forward, attempting to intercept. Maria raised her rifle, firing bursts with unerring accuracy, keeping the attackers at bay. The SEALs followed her lead, moving with synchronized efficiency, covering each other as they approached the safety of the arriving vehicles. Sand kicked up in clouds around them, bullets ricocheted, and the roar of engines filled the air. Yet Maria pressed on, refusing to falter, every step bringing them closer to survival. Finally, they reached the edge of the open desert where the extraction vehicles waited. Helicopters hovered, their blades throwing sand and debris into the air. The SEALs scrambled aboard, exhausted but alive. Maria climbed last, her arms trembling, heart pounding in her chest. As the helicopter lifted off, she looked down at the compound and the desert stretching endlessly behind them. Relief washed over her, mingled with lingering fear and adrenaline. They had survived, but the battle had changed them all. Maria realized she would never see herself or the world the same way again. Inside the helicopter, the SEAL's eyes met hers. Gratitude, disbelief, and respect radiated from their expressions. Torres gave her a weak smile, his eyes wet with unspoken emotion. One of the team veterans murmured, "You kept us alive." "Maria," she nodded silently, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relief. The reality of what had just occurred, the ambush, the firefight, her transformation from cook to combatant settled heavily on her shoulders. She had crossed a boundary she never thought possible. And in doing so, she had discovered a courage she had never known existed. The flight back to base was tense. The SEALs were quiet, reflecting on the narrow escape, the cost of mistakes, and the woman who had led them through it. Maria sat with a rifle in her lap, staring out at the desert below. Every grain of sand, every ridge, every shadow reminded her of the fragility of life. She had fought and survived in a world that had previously seemed unimaginable. But she knew this was only the beginning. Her life, her identity, and her understanding of courage had irrevocably changed. By the time the base came into view, Maria felt the weight of exhaustion, pressed down like a lead blanket. Her body ached, her hands were raw, and her mind was racing. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that she had done the impossible. She had saved her team. She had survived combat. And she had discovered that bravery didn't belong solely to those in uniform. It could rise, unexpected, from the most ordinary of people. Maria Alvarez, the civilian cook, had become something extraordinary. And she would never be the same again. As they touched down, the team moved quickly, debriefing and securing equipment. Maria remained seated for a moment, gathering herself. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving her drained but unbroken. She knew reinforcements would soon arrive to process the compound, gather intelligence, and care for the wounded. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The desert had tested her, demanded everything, and yet she had survived. More than that, she had led, protected, and fought. And she knew deep down that the challenges ahead would demand the same unwavering courage. The desert had grown darker, the sun dipping behind distant ridges, casting long shadows across the sand. Maria Alvarez's muscles ached, her palms raw from gripping the rifle, and her lungs burned from the rapid pace of the escape. Yet there was no time to rest. The militants had not been entirely neutralized. They were regrouping, seeking any advantage to reclaim what had been lost. Maria knew that every moment of hesitation could cost lives. She had to lead, to guide the SEALs, to remain a shield between them and the chaos that threatened to swallow them whole. Torres stumbled slightly, wincing in pain as his leg throbbed. Maria grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Keep moving," she urged, voice firm but calm. "We're almost there. Don't stop now." The other SEALs flanked her, providing cover and silently acknowledging her leadership. Each step through the desert felt like walking a tightrope. One misstep could alert the militants. One sound could trigger a deadly ambush. Maria's eyes darted constantly, noting the glint of weapons, the silhouettes of figures in the distance, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. Her mind raced, calculating, strategizing, and improvising simultaneously. Ahead, the terrain dropped into a shallow canyon that could serve both as cover and trap. Maria paused at the edge, scanning the area. She noticed movement, 2 armed militants approaching from the ridge above. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to focus. She could take the shot, or she could wait for a better angle. Every instinct screamed urgency, yet every ounce of training and observation urged patience. She raised her rifle and fired, taking out the first militant. The second ducked behind a rock, momentarily disoriented. Maria motioned to the SEALs to move, guiding them with whispered instructions. The canyon offered partial concealment, but it also funneled their movement, creating a bottleneck. Maria knew they had to move quickly before more militants arrived. She took the lead, signaling the SEALs to follow. Each movement was deliberate, her rifle raised, senses heightened. The desert was both ally and enemy, offering cover, yet hiding dangers at every turn. Sand shifted underfoot, sending small rocks tumbling. But Maria pressed on, relying on rhythm, observation, and instinct. She could feel the weight of her responsibility pressing down. The lives of her team rested in her hands, and failure was unthinkable. Suddenly, a shout echoed across the canyon. More militants were approaching, their numbers greater than Maria had anticipated. She ducked behind a boulder, signaling the SEALs to halt. 2 at a time, she whispered. Stay low. Cover each other. Bullets began to ricochet around them, kicking up sand and debris. Maria's hands burned from firing. Her arms ached, and sweat streamed into her eyes. Yet her focus never wavered. She fired carefully, eliminating threats, her aim precise despite exhaustion. The SEALs moved with her rhythm, covering each other, trusting her implicitly. Torres stumbled again, this time falling hard onto the sand. Maria scrambled to his side, cutting strips from her own shirt to bind his wound more securely. We're not done, she murmured, voice tight with urgency. Get up. We move now. She helped him to his feet, scanning the approaching militants. Another burst of fire sent one attacker sprawling. Maria's adrenaline surged, fear tempered by fierce determination. She realized she was no longer merely helping them escape, she was actively defending them, orchestrating their survival in a landscape that had once been alien and terrifying. As they neared the canyon's exit, the terrain opened into a small plateau. Here, the militants were attempting to cut them off. Maria assessed the situation. The ridge offered high ground to the enemy, while scattered rocks provided cover for her team. She devised a plan on the spot. Split up, she instructed. 2 cover, 2 move forward. We flank them. The SEALs followed her lead without question. Maria's heart raced as she sprinted toward the first cover point, rifle raised, guiding the team with a combination of signals, shouts, and precise timing. The first burst of fire came from the ridge above, forcing Maria to dive behind a rock. Sand exploded around her as bullets struck nearby, yet she kept her focus, scanning for the optimal moment to return fire. Her body was on fire from exertion, every muscle trembling, but she felt a strange clarity. Fear still existed, but it had evolved into sharp, controlled awareness. She fired again, her aim steady, watching as the militants faltered under the unexpected resistance of a civilian leading trained warriors. Movement from the other side of the plateau drew her attention. A small group of militants was attempting to flank them, likely unaware of Maria's precise coordination. She raised her rifle and fired, taking one down while signaling the SEALs to adjust positions. The team moved seamlessly, covering one another, adapting to her instructions. Maria's leadership had become instinctive. Every decision was immediate, calculated, and necessary. The desert, once a place of isolation, had transformed into a battlefield she now commanded with both courage and precision. Hours seemed to pass in minutes as they navigated the plateau. Maria's arms were trembling, her vision blurred from sweat and sand, yet she pressed on. Each step was a mixture of strategy and survival. She could hear distant gunfire from reinforcements engaging the remaining militants, but it was far too soon for relief. Every second demanded vigilance. Every shadow required assessment. Yet despite exhaustion, Maria felt a surge of power and purpose. She was no longer a passive observer. She was an active force, protecting the men who had become her family in a world that had demanded bravery beyond expectation. Finally, they reached a narrow strip of desert that led to their extraction point. The seals, bruised and bloodied, moved with renewed determination. Maria adjusted their path to avoid open areas and potential ambush points. Her mind was a combination of calculation and instinct, every movement deliberate. The helicopters had not yet arrived, but the distant sound of engines offered hope. Maria guided the team with unwavering precision, ensuring that each SEAL maintained cover and that Torres, despite his injury, could keep pace. A sudden shout startled Maria. A lone militant had appeared near the final approach. She fired instinctively, hitting him before he could raise his weapon. The SEALs moved quickly, following her lead. The extraction vehicles were visible now, their engines slicing through the desert air, stirring sand and debris. Relief mingled with exhaustion, but Maria remained alert, guiding the team to board the vehicles safely. She lifted Torres into the Humvee, then climbed it herself, rifle still at the ready. The team was alive, and for the first time in hours, Maria allowed herself a fleeting moment of satisfaction. As the vehicles moved toward the helicopters, the wind whipping past and sand scattering behind them, Maria glanced at the SEALs. Gratitude, awe, and disbelief were written across their faces. "You saved us," one whispered, voice choked. Maria shook her head, exhausted but resolute. "We saved each other," she replied quietly. The desert below stretched endlessly, a reminder of the dangers they had faced and the courage they had discovered within themselves. Maria realized that she had crossed an irreversible threshold, from civilian to protector, from observer to warrior. Her life and theirs would never be the same. By the time the helicopters lifted off, Maria's exhaustion hit her fully. Her body shook with fatigue, muscles screaming, hands blistered. Yet beneath the pain, a fierce sense of accomplishment burned bright. She had led, she had fought, she had protected. The desert had tested her, demanded everything, and she had risen to the occasion. The SEALs, once laughing at her nickname, now looked at her with profound respect. Maria Alvarez, the civilian cook, had become more than anyone expected, more than even she had imagined. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast, unforgiving expanse of sand, rock, and scorching sun. Maria Alvarez sat upright in the back of the Humvee, her rifle cradled in her arms, eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. Exhaustion gnawed at her muscles, and her palms were raw from hours of gripping weapons and hauling her team through perilous terrain. But the extraction point was close, and she could not falter. Not now, not when the SEALs depended on her. She had already survived impossible odds. Now she had to lead them through the final gauntlet. The convoy slowed as the first signs of enemy resistance appeared. Dust rose in columns, and Maria spotted figures silhouetted against the fading sun, armed and advancing with lethal intent. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rhythmic drumbeat that matched the tension in the air. The SEALs shifted, flanking her as she guided the Humvee to cover. "Get ready," she hissed, voice calm but resolute. "We hold here until the others catch up. Watch every angle." Her instincts were razor-sharp, honed by hours of observation and adrenaline. The militants opened fire, bullets snapping around them, ricocheting off metal and rock. Maria ducked instinctively, scanning for an angle to return fire without exposing herself. The Humvee shuddered under impact, sand spraying into the air. She raised her rifle, taking deliberate aim, and fired, hitting one of the attackers advancing from the ridge. Another SEAL moved to cover the rear while she provided suppressive fire, her body trembling with exhaustion, but fueled by determination. Every second counted. Every missed shot could mean death. Torres groaned beside her, clutching his wounded leg. Maria reached for him, helping to stabilize his weight. "Almost there," she whispered. "Keep moving. We're not stopping now." The Humvee lurched forward, weaving between rocks and debris, bullets striking the metal with deadly rhythm. Maria adjusted her aim, firing at shadows that could be threats. She felt a mix of fear and exhilaration, an awareness of mortality, tempered by a fierce drive to protect the men who had become her family. Ahead, a ridge blocked the direct route to the extraction point. Maria assessed the terrain quickly. There was only one path, narrow, exposed, and filled with enemy positions. She didn't hesitate. "We go fast, we go low, we go smart," she instructed. The SEALs nodded, trusting her judgment implicitly. She led the vehicle toward the ridge, bullets kicking up sand and dust around them. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that concealed both danger and opportunity. Maria's every movement was calculated, every decision sharpened by necessity. As they approached the ridge, a group of militants appeared, attempting to flank them. Maria's mind raced. Retreat was impossible. A frontal assault could be fatal. She raised her rifle, firing with precision, each shot deliberate. The SEALs moved in synchronized patterns, covering each other, responding instantly to her commands. The militants faltered under their combined firepower. Maria's body shook with adrenaline, sweat streaming into her eyes, yet her focus remained unbroken. She had become the team's anchor, their guiding force in a world where chaos ruled. The Humvee reached the narrow pass, and Maria guided the team through it with care. Rocks and debris littered the path, and every step risked alerting the enemy. Sand sprayed around them with every shot fired, and bullets cracked close enough to sting. Maria's arms burned, her vision blurred, but she pressed on. She had already crossed lines she never imagined she would. Fear existed, yes, but it had transformed into clarity, courage, and unwavering resolve. She was no longer simply surviving. She was leading, protecting, and fighting for the lives of those who trusted her. A sudden movement on the ridge drew her attention. 2 militants had climbed higher, attempting to intercept them before the extraction vehicles could reach safety. Maria aimed quickly, firing a precise shot that took down one attacker. The second froze, and she fired again, hitting him squarely in the shoulder. He collapsed, screaming, and Maria ducked instinctively, heart hammering. She glanced at the SEALs. Their faces reflected a mix of disbelief and relief. Could it really be this woman, a civilian cook, saving them in the heat of combat? She didn't pause to answer. There was no time. The final stretch to the extraction zone was in sight. The helicopters hovered low, their rotors kicking up clouds of sand and debris. Maria's muscles screamed in protest, fatigue threatening to overcome her, but she pushed every ounce of strength forward. She adjusted Torres in the Humvee, ensuring he could maintain his balance despite the injury. The other SEALs moved with her rhythm, every step coordinated, every shot calculated. The militants were regrouping for one last assault, but Maria met each challenge head-on, her body and mind operating in perfect synchronization. A hail of bullets struck the Humvee, rattling metal and sending sparks flying. Maria returned fire, targeting each visible threat with lethal precision. Her arms burned, her vision blurred from sweat and sand, but she pressed on. The SEALs covered each other, following her lead, and together they fought through the final gauntlet. Maria's heart pounded in her chest, every nerve alight with adrenaline. She had become the linchpin, the protector, and the orchestrator of their survival. The desert had tested her, and she had passed with courage that few could comprehend. Finally, they reached the helicopters. Maria guided the SEALs to board quickly, ensuring everyone was accounted for. She helped Torres into the aircraft, then climbed aboard herself, rifle still at the ready. The rotors lifted them into the sky, carrying them above the desert and away from danger. Relief flooded through Maria, mingled with exhaustion and disbelief. They had survived. The SEALs were alive, and she had led them through one of the most harrowing combat situations imaginable. Inside the helicopter, the team finally allowed themselves a moment to breathe. The SEAL's eyes met hers, gratitude and awe evident. "You saved us," Torres whispered, his voice weak but sincere. Maria shook her head, exhausted but resolute. "We saved each other," she replied quietly. The desert below stretched endlessly, a stark reminder of the dangers they had faced and the courage they had unearthed within themselves. Maria realized she would never be the same woman who had walked into that base with knives and aprons. The flight back to the naval base was tense but quieter. The SEALs sat in silence, reflecting on the narrow escape, the miraculous survival, and the woman who had led them through chaos. Maria rested for the first time, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her mind alert. She had fought, led, and protected in ways she never imagined possible. Her identity as a civilian cook had evolved into something far greater. Maria Alvarez was now a warrior, a guardian, and an unshakable force. Upon landing, medics rushed to assess the wounded, including Torres. Maria remained seated, rifle still at her side, reflecting on the events that had transformed her life. The SEAL commander approached, face solemn but filled with respect. "You acted when no one else could," he said quietly. "Unarmed, untrained in combat. You saved my team. That is courage beyond words." Maria felt the weight of the words settle over her, a mix of pride, disbelief, and humility. She had done what she never thought possible and survived. Hours later, Maria finally allowed herself to rest. The adrenaline had ebbed, leaving her body exhausted, but her mind alive with the memories of the mission. She thought of the SEALs, their gratitude, and the bonds forged in fire and danger. She realized that the desert, the ambush, and the near-death experience had forged a courage and resilience she could never have imagined. Maria Alvarez, the civilian cook, had crossed into a new realm of bravery, one that would define her life from that moment onward. The helicopter touched down at the naval base, sand and debris swirling in its wake. Maria Alvarez's body ached, muscles screaming from hours of combat, but her mind was alive, buzzing with adrenaline and disbelief. The SEALs she had guided and protected scrambled out first, rushing to medics, their faces reflecting relief, exhaustion, and gratitude. Maria followed slowly, each step deliberate, the weight of what had just occurred pressing heavily on her chest. The desert, the ambush, the firefights, it all felt like a surreal blur. She had survived, and she had led them through hell. Medical personnel immediately attended to Torres, his leg bandaged and stabilized. Maria stood nearby, still clutching her rifle, feeling the weight of responsibility slowly lift. The SEAL commander approached, his face set in a serious but respectful expression. "Maria," he said, voice low but firm, "you've done something extraordinary today. You acted with bravery, intelligence, and precision. You saved lives." Maria's chest tightened, a mix of pride and disbelief. She had never imagined hearing such words. She had been a cook, an observer, and suddenly, in hours, she had become a hero. The team began recounting the events of the ambush to base personnel. Maria listened quietly, still in shock, yet aware of the magnitude of her actions. Every detail, every maneuver, every calculated shot she had taken was now being analyzed and praised. One of the veteran SEALs pulled her aside, shaking his head in awe. "I've never seen anyone move like that under fire," he said. "You kept us alive. Every move you made was perfect. How did you do it?" Maria shook her head, trying to digest it herself. "I just did what needed to be done," she murmured. Despite the praise, Maria's thoughts drifted back to the desert, to the sounds of gunfire, the heat of the sand underfoot, the fear and adrenaline that had driven her every action. She remembered the look in Torres' eyes when she had lifted him, the silent gratitude in the other SEALs' faces, and the surreal sense of responsibility that had transformed her. She had been terrified, yes, but fear had been tempered by determination. Survival had demanded courage, and she had discovered within herself a reservoir she never knew existed. As the hours passed, Maria was escorted to the debriefing room. Military personnel began documenting the ambush, the tactics employed, and her role in the rescue. The officers listened intently as she recounted every detail her decisions, the movements, the calculated risks. Each time she described an action, the room grew quiet, the gravity of her courage sinking in. The SEAL commander nodded solemnly. "You've redefined what bravery looks like," he said. "Not just skill, but heart, courage, and presence of mind under fire." Maria felt a lump in her throat. Words could not capture the chaos, the fear, and the determination she had felt in those hours. Later, she was taken to the barracks, where the SEAL team had gathered. They surrounded her, clapping her on the shoulder, shaking her hands, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and deep respect. "We owe our lives to you," Torres said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. Maria felt tears prick her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She had been a cook, a civilian, someone who had never imagined stepping onto a battlefield. And yet, here she was, honored and revered by men who had trained for years to survive in such environments. In the quiet of the night, Maria finally allowed herself to sit, her back against a wall, her rifle resting across her lap. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but her mind was still active, replaying every moment of the ambush and escape. She thought of the desert, the sand, the heat, and the fear that had surged through her. She thought of the SEALs, the lives she had saved, and the transformation she had undergone. Her identity as a civilian cook had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer the same woman who had walked into the base that morning. She was someone stronger, braver, and irrevocably changed. The next morning, Maria was called to the commander's office. She entered to find several senior officers waiting, their expressions solemn but approving. "Maria Alvarez once said, 'Your actions yesterday went above and beyond anything we could have expected. You displayed courage, leadership, and presence of mind that saved lives. We are awarding you a special commendation for your bravery under fire.'" Maria felt her chest tighten, disbelief mixing with a profound sense of honor. Recognition of her actions was overwhelming, yet she could only nod quietly, words failing her. Later, the team gathered to celebrate the debriefing and recovery. The atmosphere was subdued, but filled with quiet gratitude. The SEALs recounted moments where Maria's quick thinking had prevented disaster. Each story reinforced the reality of her courage. She laughed softly, though the sound felt foreign to her ears. She had always been the cook, the one behind the scenes, offering comfort and nourishment. Now, she was the one who had saved lives, whose actions had altered the course of events in a deadly ambush. The juxtaposition left her both humbled and astonished. Yet amidst the praise, Maria grappled with complex emotions. Relief, pride, and exhaustion mingled with the lingering fear and the memories of the desert. She thought of those she had fought, those she had eliminated, and the fine line between survival and death. The reality of combat, of life and death decisions made in split seconds, weighed heavily on her. Maria realized that while she had acted with courage, the experience had changed her fundamentally. She had seen the extremes of human behavior, the fragility of life, and the inner strength required to protect others. In the days that followed, Maria received messages and visits from other units praising her actions. She was invited to speak at briefings, sharing her perspective on courage, decision-making under pressure, and leadership in unexpected circumstances. Each time she recounted her experiences, she felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had never imagined herself in these situations, yet she had acted decisively and effectively. Maria's story became an example for others, a testament to the idea that courage could emerge from the most unlikely places. Despite the recognition and accolades, Maria remained grounded. She returned to the kitchen briefly, preparing meals for the SEALs, her apron once again covering her battle-worn attire. Yet the experience had left a permanent mark. She no longer approached her role as a cook simply as nourishment for the body. She now fed morale, resilience, and courage. The SEALs looked at her differently, not just as the woman who baked meals, but as the woman who had fought beside them, protected them, and led them through unimaginable danger. Maria Alvarez had become both guardian and hero. That night, as she finally rested, Maria reflected on the transformation she had undergone. The desert had tested her in ways she never imagined. The ambush had demanded her courage, resilience, and resourcefulness. She had led, protected, and fought not for recognition, but because survival demanded it. And through it all, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Maria Alvarez, once a civilian cook, had emerged as a symbol of courage, a testament to the power of determination, and a force that could inspire others even in the face of overwhelming danger. The desert had long since faded behind her, but the memories remained vivid, etched into Maria Alvarez's mind like scars of fire and sand. Back at the base, the bustle of daily operations resumed, but Maria felt a profound shift within herself. She had been a civilian cook, a role defined by service, comfort, and routine. Now, she was something else entirely: a protector, a leader, a warrior, forged in the crucible of extreme circumstances. The SEALs treated her with a newfound respect, their laughter and camaraderie mingling with a deep acknowledgement of the courage she had displayed. Days turned into weeks, and Maria slowly reintegrated into base life, though her perspective had irreversibly changed. Every corner of the facility seemed charged with meaning. The kitchen, once a sanctuary of simple meals and light conversation, now carried a heavier resonance. Each plate she prepared felt infused with understanding nourishment, not just for the body, but for resilience, morale, and the quiet courage she now recognized in everyone around her. The SEALs returned to their rigorous training schedules, yet they often paused to share a word, a smile, or a nod of respect with her. Maria realized she had earned more than gratitude. She had earned their trust, their admiration, and an indelible place in their lives. The commendation ceremony was held in the main hangar, a spacious hall filled with the hum of helicopters, murmurs of personnel, and the quiet weight of solemn respect. Maria stood in uniform, rifle at her side, her hands still slightly trembling from the months of tension and action. The commanding officer approached, carefully reading from a prepared statement that chronicled her courage, her actions under fire, and her extraordinary leadership. "Maria Alvarez," he said, voice echoing across the room, "your bravery has saved lives, inspired your comrades, and redefined the limits of courage. Today, we honor you." The room erupted in applause, and Maria's chest tightened. She had never imagined such recognition. Torres, still recovering from his leg injury, approached her after the ceremony, his eyes glistening. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said, voice choked. Maria shook her head, a soft smile on her face. "You don't have to. Just live, fight, and keep moving forward. That's enough." His hand clasped hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured together. Maria realized that this was the true reward, the bonds forged in fire, the trust earned in life or death moments, and the knowledge that she had made a real difference. Over the following days, Maria found herself reflecting deeply on the events that had changed her life. The ambush, the firefights, the strategic decisions each moment replayed vividly, and yet the experience had also given her clarity. Courage was not about rank or training. It was about presence of mind, determination, and the willingness to act despite fear. She had discovered a strength within herself she never knew existed, a resilience that allowed her to confront danger head-on and protect those who depended on her. Maria's identity had expanded beyond the kitchen, beyond her role as a civilian, into something far more enduring and powerful. The SEALs often sought her out, recounting stories of their missions, sharing experiences, and discussing tactics. Maria listened, her insights valued in ways she had never anticipated. The team's respect was palpable. They deferred to her judgment, asked for her opinions, and included her in strategic discussions. Maria had become more than a symbol of courage. She was a trusted advisor, a presence that could shift the course of a mission through insight, observation, and decisive action. The lines between civilian and warrior had blurred, and Maria embraced this duality with quiet determination. One evening, as the sun set over the base, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Maria found herself alone in the kitchen. The quiet hum of activity around her contrasted with the intensity of the events she had survived. She reflected on the journey from a cook who had never imagined handling a rifle to a woman who had fought LED and protected a SEAL team in combat. Her hands rested on the counter, tired but steady, as she traced the edges of the knives she once used solely for preparing meals. Each tool now symbolized more than sustenance. It represented precision, adaptability, and the will to survive. The team approached quietly, standing just outside the kitchen doorway. No words were spoken at first. They simply observed her, sharing in the quiet reflection of her newfound identity. Torres stepped forward, limping slightly, and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You've changed all of us," he said softly. "Not just because you saved our lives, but because you've shown what courage really looks like." Maria's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, humbled by the acknowledgement. She realized that her actions had rippled far beyond the immediate battlefield. She had inspired, shaped, and left an indelible mark on those who had once seemed untouchable in their training and expertise. Recognition continued in small and significant ways. The SEALs began informal rituals to honor her presence. A shared toast after training sessions, careful attention to her guidance in simulations, and an unspoken respect in every conversation. Maria became a bridge between worlds, between the civilian life she had left behind and the warrior life she had embraced. The duality was both challenging and empowering. She now understood that bravery was not a singular act, but a sustained willingness to face uncertainty, to protect, and to act decisively when stakes were highest. One day, Maria was called to speak with the commanding officer again. He commended her not only for her actions during the ambush, but also for her influence on the team afterward. "Maria," he said, "you've reminded all of us that courage comes in many forms. You've inspired a unit of elite warriors to see strength differently. That's a legacy few leave behind." Maria nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words. She had begun this journey as a cook, wholly unprepared for the demands of combat, and now she stood recognized as an exemplar of courage, resilience, and leadership. In the quiet moments, Maria often thought back to the desert, to the blistering heat, the blinding sand, and the moments when death seemed inevitable. She remembered the fear, the adrenaline, and the absolute clarity required to make split-second decisions. Those memories were no longer sources of terror. They were reminders of her inner strength. She realized that the desert had not merely tested her. It had transformed her, unlocking a potential she had never imagined. Maria Alvarez, the woman who once only stirred pots and baked bread, had become a symbol of courage that would endure long after the events themselves had faded. Months later, Maria continued her work at the base, balancing duties in the kitchen with her newfound role as a mentor, advisor, and symbol of resilience. The SEALs respected her presence, valued her insights, and often sought her counsel in both professional and personal matters. Maria had discovered that true courage was not just about surviving the battlefield, but about embracing responsibility, leading with clarity, and protecting others even when fear threatened to dominate. Her transformation was complete, and yet it was only the beginning of a new chapter in her life. As Maria looked out over the desert from the base, the horizon bathed in the soft light of dusk, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had faced unimaginable danger, led the SEALs through life and death situations, and emerged stronger, wiser, and forever changed. The desert had given her fear, adrenaline, and clarity, and she had used all three to save lives. Maria Alvarez, the civilian cook who had once served meals quietly behind the scenes, had discovered within herself a courage that would never be forgotten. And in that quiet moment, she understood. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act, to protect, and to lead, no matter the odds.